Be here now. Just be here now.
Welcome to the Road Home podcast with Ethan Nichtern. Join Ethan as he and his guests explore the Buddhist path as it relates to art, culture, activism, politics, Western psychology, and more. If you'd like to support Ethan's podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/Ethan.
So, hi, everybody. This is Ethan Nichtern, and welcome back to the Road Home podcast. I'm here today. I'm happy to be here with my friend Jacoby Ballard, old friend, whose book, A Queer Dharma, Yoga and Meditations for Liberation, is just about out now. And we're going to talk about that and other things. So Jacoby, welcome to the Road Home podcast.
Thank you so much, Ethan. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's been a little while since we've seen each other. So I need a better starter question, and I say that pretty much every time. But whenever somebody is a meditator person, and in your case, a author and teacher, I always ask for their origin story with meditation, and obviously that's in your book as well. So, how did you get into this world?
I think that's a great first question, actually, because I know from my own experience and from being a teacher that most people come into meditation from an experience of suffering. And so it's usually, there could be a lot of interesting answers there. I started meditating in high school as a high school senior as part of a senior project that a group called Student Empowerment that I was part of was piloting. And I just kind of chose meditation out of nowhere. And I was in a small Rocky Mountain town in Colorado. There's no yoga studios, no meditation that I knew of. Like, it wasn't like a thing like it is now in 1988. And it did two things for me. One is, at that point, I had been bullied for about 6 years in my schools, being perceived as queer. I wasn't out even to myself as queer yet, but I was marked as different and people seized upon it. And so meditation gave me a sense of like an experience that I can have inside, a love that I can have experience inside that nothing on the outside can tamper with or threaten or assault. That there's some part of me that's untouchable. And then I was also a 3-sport athlete and very dedicated to my basketball game in particular. And it made me an unstoppable free throw shooter. And I think that was like surviving the bullying was like big picture, like very important. But like in the moment, my basketball game improving is what like kept me at it. Because I could just focus. It was just me, the ball in the basket, the crowds, the coaches, the score. It didn't matter because I'd been training my mind to focus in that way.
That is the most interesting and kind of maybe binary in some ways, sort of purpose, for what meditation does for a young person. So it helps you go to an internal space where bullying does not harm, or the external world does not feel harmful, and it makes you a killer free throw shooter. So we can talk about basketball later. Kevin Durant's my favorite player. Kyrie Irving has become my least favorite player recently. So, wow, yeah. So, I mean, can you talk a little bit more of that experience of the external world not touching you when you were practicing, of sort of dealing with that harm or that, feeling ostracized, or and how meditation protected you from that or let you go, to a safe place with that?
Yeah. I think before that point, developmentally, I was certainly like very externally oriented, and already being a survivor of childhood sexual abuse at that point, was very accustomed to focusing my attention on the external world to make sure that I was okay, because what the external world was doing, which was much more impactful on me than what was going on in my own body, heart, mind. And so meditation then kind of flipped that on the head and taught me to focus actually more on what's going on internally and work with that and focus and let go of kind of all the noise on the outside. And also that wasn't the essence of me. Whatever they're judging, whatever they're shaming me for, there's so much more that they aren't even aware of. And so it just gave me a little bit of space.
Yeah. So kind of an internal mode of validation.
Yeah.
I mean, there must have been some external validation too, right? I mean, that seems like a huge ask for a young person to get all of your sense of I'm okay or this isn't me from going inward.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think at the time, like if we had spoken when I was a senior in high school, I don't think I would have talked about the bullying at all. Like I wasn't even like aware of it at the time. I was just surviving it. So it's now like looking back to be like, oh, meditation is one of the things. And 3 teachers that I had in the school that were anchors for me that were like, you're going to blossom after high school. Those were the resources that I had that got me through it, but I wouldn't have known it at the time. At the time, I was just totally compelled by my basketball game, and that's why I kept sitting.
Awesome. And I mean, did being really good at basketball help with the bullying at all? I mean, it feels like that would give a little bit of external credibility to bullies. I don't know.
One of my bullies was actually another athlete, and she was a year above me. And whenever I had a better game than her or got more time on the court than her, like then the bullying escalated. So no, it didn't protect me.
So I'm wondering how this comes into as you make your way into your adult life. Then, did meditation remain, and maybe as yoga became part of your life, did these remain kind of internal, like sort of more individual practices for your own sort of personal protection or personal sense of safety, or what was your experience as you kind of went into, I guess what I'm asking, the larger meditation and yoga worlds as they existed as you were coming of age?
I was mandated in college to take yoga because there's a wellness credit that I hadn't fulfilled. I had missed the boat on everything else. And so if I was going to graduate, I had to complete this wellness credit by the end of my sophomore year. And the woman that I had to study with was a 70-year-old woman from Maine named Lillian, and she had learned yoga when she was 50, and so then by then been practicing for 20 years. She'd also become a massage therapist. She had also become literate. There's like so many changes that happened in her life as a result of yoga and meditation. She picked up a Zen meditation practice as well. And so when I met her and wanted to study more with her, the way to study more was to go sit in her Sunday morning, 8 a.m. Zen meditation group, which is not the optimal time for a college student to sit. But for weirdo me, somehow it worked. That I would I would run down to her. I would run off the hill that my college was seated upon and run down into town to her little basement and sit with like 8 other people every Sunday morning. And it was that experience of Sangha, I think, also was quite compelling to me. That it was sometimes one of my friends came, but often I was the only college student there. And there was my poetry professor and a university administrator and a woodworker and a plumber from town. And I was just like, how are all of these people? This is bizarre. Like, we would never be in the same place together if we weren't doing Zen together. But they became like such a, it was such a place of refuge, to be able to be, kind of burst the college bubble and just be with other humans that are just living their lives.
And what, I mean, I think I remember at my college, I was doing a lot of meditation and stuff outside of my college, but I think I remember that there was a Zen group that sat like Sundays it might've been like 7 a.m. and I didn't make it to that. Maybe I went once, but so what was it that compelled you to get there? Was it your previous meditation experience in high school? Was it just, your kind of, inspiration by your teacher, by Lillian, or like what, or was it just some internal drive, or like what made you show up Sunday at 8 a.m. as a college student?
That's a really good question, Ethan. I'm not really sure. I mean, I'm someone that tends towards extremity. So like getting there at 8 a.m. felt like a challenge that I was down for. I also, in high school, I was part of the like drug and alcohol free club, and that carried on to my college years. I definitely dabbled in substances, and also became aware of my family's history of alcoholism in particular during college. And so it just seemed like this is not a good idea to like invest in the college drinking scene. And perhaps a better idea to invest in this practice that like this 50-year-old plumber also finds meaning from. So I think that who the people were and that they were all coming together because Zen had improved their life was compelling to me.
Yeah. So let's maybe get into the notion of Dharma and a queer Dharma. I mean, and I'm wondering, like, as you start to practice more, as you start to teach, you start teaching yoga before you start teaching meditation, right? So,
yeah.
So obviously, when you look at the origins of these traditions, there's not a lot of sense of social location, right? In or any of the various orientations that we know of and work with in modern life, right? There's not like Dharma for group X or, Dharma for group Y or marginalized or, privileged positions. There's just like the Four Noble Truths, but it seems to be really clear in modern work that different bodies, different groups experience the Dharma, if not differently, then at least distinctly, right? And that's, I think, there's a lot of recent books and work and teachers that I think, this book and your work fits into, of like really sort of teasing apart, well, this is distinct in some way, right? So how did you start to see that distinctness of maybe queer Dharma, or any other type of Dharma, but queer, since that's what we're talking about here?
Going to yoga classes in New York City in particular, when I had just come out as trans and hadn't done any kind of medical transition, but was socially transitioned, experienced so much harm in those classrooms where there was a lot of assumptions made about my body and about other people in the room. And it was much more common then than I would say it is now to say, women's bodies are good at this and men's bodies are good at this. And if you're a man, put your hands like this for the mudra. And if you're a woman, put your hands like this. So those microaggressions kind of illuminated for me, like I need a different kind of space to practice in. Like I know that these teachings have value and can positively impact my life, but I don't know if I can stay with it if I have to experience these microaggressions every time. So I started teaching queer and trans yoga at the LGBT Center in New York as a way. I mean, I was just reading last night in Mia Birdsong's book that like so many people, when you need a space yourself, so many of us just create that space, right? And so creating queer and trans yoga and allowing that space for my students to practice where their bodies were not judged or surveilled, and where there wasn't the same kind of harm. That said, I also know that all of us drink the Kool-Aid of systems of oppression, and there's probably still ways that I enacted different kinds of aggression as well, subtly or not so subtly, to different people. But I think a difference for me is that coming from a social justice background, which I had also become a social justice activist in college, influenced how I taught and what I was committed to politically, and who I knew that it was important to watch those microaggressions in myself, and to, as part of the internal practice in yoga, it's svadhyaya, self-study, in Buddhism, just the experience of sitting. Like, it's very important to watch the ways that I've internalized the larger culture, and the ways that then I project it outwards, and to over time, as I deepened in my own practice, to limit that more and more.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I took a lot of yoga class as a cisgendered straight white male, in the early 2000s, in my, early mid 20s, took a lot of yoga classes, and that was embarrassing too,
Sure.
From that perspective, because it's obviously to be in a very privileged position, but you step into a yoga class, and you're surrounded by people you think are cute, and you often then the people who you think are cute get to watch you be clumsy and tight and bad at things. So I can only imagine then when you add, being misgendered or made assumptions of, et cetera. It's a very vulnerable space, period. And it's a group, individual space and a group space. I wonder, can we define a little bit more how you understand in teachings microaggression, how you understand just that as a kind of term? Does it refer to unintentional aggression for you? Does it refer to intentional aggression?
Both. I mean, I feel like that's part of what's reflected in the meta phrases, right? If I've impacted, or in the forgiveness phrases, if I've impacted you knowingly or unknowingly in my thoughts, words, or actions. Microaggressions can both be intentional and unintentional. I think it's hardest to identify when they're unintentional, right? Because that's just culture living through us, being breathed through us. I'm not intending to be racist, but I'm recycling it unless I'm like actively working on noticing those slight phrases or ways of being or understanding the world that gets reflected in how I speak, that then creates harm for my BIPOC siblings. I think microaggressions, I would say, are largely unintentional, but they can also be certainly intentional. From like, I'm thinking of like being in classrooms with like economics majors who are like very invested in capitalism and like dismissing women in the room, and like just that can be part of competing with one another, that like we push each other down with whatever tools we have, whether it's racism or misogyny or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, when it seems like a lot of why we don't want to admit that we engage in, aggression is, I think, in racism and anti-racism, it really seems like there continues to be an investment. And I've talked to people about this, in sort of being, for example, a good white person, and rather so being called. I mean, to me, the notion of acknowledging systemic racism is such a relief, because you can kind of stop, you can give up, you can try to be an ally,
right?
You can try to learn, but you can give up that idea of like, am I racist? Am I not racist? And just admit like these like these systems live in me, right. But that sort of that need to be good is sort of, I mean, that's a really interesting identity. And I wonder how much, because these practices are about self-development, I wonder if sometimes they even provoke us further to want to be good and therefore not make mistakes or not have oppression live in us.
Yeah, I think that's the value and part of my investment in the forgiveness practice, that it's part of our humanity that we're going to cause harm. It's inevitable. Right. And so then we need to have these internal practices to reckon with that, so that then we can make the shift internally that will be reflected through our words and actions.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you establish a space that is not, just the dominant space, that is a queer space or a trans space, I mean, what is it for you as somebody who's established that, created your own space, taught in that, practice in that? Like, how would you say? What would you say is the power of creating such a space? Is it, because I just imagine not being the only person you identify with your mode of being and dukkha or suffering. That's powerful. But is that the main power, that you bring in people who have a similar experience?
It's being centered, and being understood, being reflected in one another's lives, whether that's like struggles with our families of origin or struggles with employers, or also the beautiful things of like, I'm thinking of one of my favorite social justice parties in New York is put on by JFRIJ, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. That's this queer Purim spiel. So I think just like watching and understanding one another, like queering the different spaces that we're in as well, and celebrating that, whether that's like dismantling the gender binary, or whether it's like queer politic that's like very much in alliance with domestic workers and formerly incarcerated people and undocumented people and the most marginalized folks of our society. I think queer is not just like a social location, but it's a political identity as well that commits us to anti-oppression.
Yeah. So what, so you've been teaching now for 15 years? Is that right?
I've been teaching yoga for 21 years.
21 years. Yeah. Wow. Since the turn of the millennium.
Uh-huh. And then teaching meditation since I studied with you. Awesome.
Yes. That's where Jacoby and I met. Jacoby did the Interdependence Project year-long teacher training. What year? 2013? 2012?
Yep.
Yeah. 2013. Yeah. 8 years ago, but feels like the distant past somehow too.
Yes.
And so I guess that's the next question, since I'm a Dharma teacher, I'm a yoga practitioner, but I know a fair number of people, although not a ton, who teach both. But how do you consider those separate? And I mean, in the book, there's a lot of crossover, but there's also a lot of distinction made between yoga teachings and Buddha Dharma teachings. What is it like teaching each? What is it like teaching both?
I think yoga asana for a long time has been separated from yoga philosophy. And one of my commitments in honoring the wholeness of the 8 limbs of yoga is to teach philosophy when I teach asana. I also see a lot of crossover between yoga philosophy and Buddhist philosophy, as well as some distinction. Both traditions have the Brahma Viharas, which has been like the most impactful teaching, I think, for me in my life. It shows up in the Yoga Sutras, and it's certainly in many lineages of Buddhism as well. I think it's interesting being in different Dharma communities where there's not necessarily as deep of a practice of embodiment. which feels like something to work on. And I know that like in a lot of retreats, there's mindful movement, and there can be Tai Chi or other kinds of movement practices. There's walking meditation. But I've learned through yoga and through my studies of trauma that so much lives in the body, that the body's a really important entryway to self-discovery and collective liberation. So I think I gravitated towards Buddhism for the philosophy, because I wasn't seeing that in a lot of my asana classes. Now it's becoming more common. But I also then I gravitated to yoga for the asana practice and for what I learned through my body, and then also as I became more familiar with the philosophies, trying the teachings on through my body, right? So like, when I'm on the mat, what does it mean to move with compassion for myself? Right. And when I'm like rolling up my mat in like a New York City studio, and it's like there's 2 inches between every mat, like how can I be in relationship with other people in the room rather than just like taking up the space I need and forgetting about everyone else. So there's ways to, I think both practices encourage us to live yoga and live the Dharma as a way of life, and not just something that's isolated to the cushion or the mat. And, they both have ethical practices that I think are incredibly important and can be lost in yoga asana and can be lost in the mindfulness industry as well.
Yes.
But that are like imperative to the practice, right? Because they are ways to not create more mess in our lives that then we have to sit with on our cushions.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting because I wanted to get in a few minutes into, the gender binary and what is harmful or what is useful about those ways of looking. If not at people, then maybe at energetic qualities. But yeah, this binary between the embodied experience and maybe philosophical or more intellectual experience. I mean, I find that the balance of the two is really important. I find that there's it's interesting because I find these days a lot of people are really, people are studying things like somatic experiencing and a lot of, embodied forms of wisdom. I was just listening to Bessel van der Kolk on Krista Tibbetts, right? The body keeps the score, about how trauma is stored in the body. But it seems like a lot of times we need more somatic experience, but sometimes I would say some people need more conceptualization, some ability to actually have a conceptual or philosophical framework to place their experience in. So it's interesting that, can you say a little bit more about balancing both? Because you do seem to be somebody who really can go in both directions in the way you experience practice and teachings, et cetera.
Yeah, I think the philosophy of Dharma especially has become so important to me as like a roadmap for like whatever arises in my life. Mm-hmm. Is it kind of feels like there's a practice for everything, and that like whatever human experience comes up through me has come up through countless practitioners through me. And so there's practices, there's things to engage at different moments in our lives. And then I think as a trans person, an embodied practice is incredibly important, because so many trans people, the like stereotype of a trans person, right, is that we're born in the wrong body. And I think we're growing out of that stereotype, that it's so much more complex than that. But I think it's any kind of separation from the body can create more harm, because we do live our lives through this body. So I think the embodied practice of yoga is so important for me to learn how to love myself and learn how to love this body. It was my asana practice that, and it's guidance from a teacher that taught me that I needed to get top surgery, because I was harming my body by binding the breast that I had. And my yoga teacher was like, ahimsa. Like, let's have surgery. Let's get through this, because this like infliction of harm on your body, like that's not workable for this lifetime. Let's find another way.
Yeah, I imagine that would also impact the ability to do asana as well.
Right, to move, to breathe. Yeah. But like, I didn't want people to see my body in a certain way, and that's not who I am. And so I was committed to that. And I also, when I would practice in my bedroom in my Brooklyn apartment, I would practice shirtless and without a binder. And then when I would go in the studio, I'd have to be more clothed, and I wouldn't want to be looked at in certain ways. So in that way, like, there was even more harm going into a studio because I couldn't fully breathe. I couldn't fully move. I was very concerned about people's perceptions of me, and got harassed in locker rooms and bathrooms, and misgendered even before I stepped onto my yoga mat.
Yeah. Harassed sounds like a macroaggression, not a microaggression to me. It's interesting because, overcoming the gender binary, it also seems like the gender binary is in a lot of ways very much in the teachings. Like, I'm thinking of Tantric Buddhism, or that there are, often bodhisattvas or kind of meditational beings will be depicted, as male-bodied or female-bodied, and they represent different aspects of wisdom. They represent different qualities. So it's interesting because gender binaries do really exist in Eastern wisdom traditions as well. And I wonder, I've always tried to resolve that as the binary being more qualitative, like rather than being man or woman, it's qualities of masculine energy and feminine energy, which any physical body can hold, So I wonder how you feel about the kind of binaries that exist in certain Eastern traditions. Are they useful? Do we need to find completely new language for the energetics? Because they still feel kind of stereotypical, Yeah,
I think Eastern masculinity in particular is very different than a Western European masculinity. And I think that there's liberation in that for all of us. There's more softness and a greater value of wisdom, and not, also a value sometimes of domination, but not exclusively. I also know that through my studies of Ayurveda, like, there's discussion of the gunas, these 10 opposing qualities that show up differently in any food we eat, any season we have, any physical human body. And for me, the gunas feel much more useful than even the label of feminine and masculine, because feminine is assumed to be, for cisgender women to embody, or trans women to aspire to, and vice versa for masculine. And it just seems really limiting to the wholeness of our humanity. That said, I also think that some of the divine figures that are depicted, they can kind of mess with those qualities as well. And there's several, both within Hindu and Buddhist lineages, that are gender crossing, and or that embody both. And so I love that as well, that's always been part of the tradition. And we see, in India, that trans people can be perceived as holy people.
Yeah. So, we're at this interesting point, where when you talk about like things like gay pride parade or something like that, everybody goes to that in New York now, including banks, including like Goldman Sachs is all about gay pride. So we've gotten to this point where it seems like being cisgender and queer is sort of accepted, right? And within that, there's this ethos of letting people just be who they are, which really seems to be like the authenticity of these traditions. We can talk about anatta or non-self, but that does seem to be where it all arrives at, right? but for some reason, transgender feels harder. We were discussing before the podcast that the famous people who are choosing like what I thought were very odd hills to die on, or, like the Dave Chappelles and J.K. Rowlings of the world, who just like, it feels like there's a non-acceptance of transgender. And why is that? Do you have a thought about why that's somehow more threatening? Is it just that it's newer in the sort of dominant culture than the notion of being cisgender queer, or is something else going on that makes it threatening to this gender binary that will maybe take more spiritual work to resolve? I don't know.
Yeah, I guess first I want to say it depends where you are in the world, how accepted queerness is. I'm living in Utah right now, and
correct. Thank you for that.
I'm in Salt Lake City, and it's there's a lot of queer folks here, and there's also a lot of closeted people who will never leave their straight marriage, but very much are queer folks, and a lot of kids that are condemned by the church here for being queer, not even trans. But on the trans issue and the like spike in like anti-trans bills around the country right now, I think there's a few things going on. One of the things I think is going on for cisgender women is it's a projection of the trauma from misogyny and sexism onto trans people, when, we didn't create the system, we're just bucking the system. And it, in some ways, a vulnerable population is an easy target to blame, right? Just like undocumented immigrants being like a threat to like white working class people. Like it's capitalism that's a threat. It's not undocumented immigrants. So that's, and I've seen that a few times in yoga community where there will be teachers speaking out against trans people, being afraid that like women's spaces are going to be eliminated or taken over by people that have caused harm historically, who people have embodiments right now that of cisgender men that or trans women that where people have trauma from the violence of masculinity. And then I think for cisgender men getting, all riled up about it, I think it's very much a grip for power. Like if there's no gender binary, then like they're not at the top anymore. And then like that's like incredibly threatening. And so let's attack those that are on the front lines of challenging that. I think there's also this like misguided notion that like trans people are like pedophiles or going to create harm in the bathrooms or on our sports teams. But like our lives have been so hard to just like be who we are, to like urinate in public could be a huge trial, that like we're not, I haven't even heard a single case where it's like a trans person has actively created violence in the bathroom, especially trans women enacting that against cisgender girls or cisgender women. Like that's not a thing. It's just a fear and a misunderstanding of like who that person is, and an idea that this is like not a very vulnerable, marginalized, targeted person, but someone that has a lot of power and is bringing that into a vulnerable space that's supposed to be only for girls or only for women. I think we're just kind of like an easy target. Yeah.
And you're absolutely, the phrase "not a thing" feels really, it really also, it feels like we have a very strong conservative, basically media structure that's really good at capturing the amygdalas, just netting the amygdalas of especially white folks, and right. Critical race theory, which has never been taught in any in any K through 12 school, and you're right, it's not, there's not, I mean, I'm sure if there was one instance, because there's usually one instance of everything happening, I'm sure that would be all over Fox News for, like months, So, yeah, it is interesting, the threat to the ego, of the notion of gender being less solid than we thought it was feels really, it almost feels like, contemplating the non-self of our gender needs to be written back into Buddhist teachings, right?
Totally. I'm raising a little presumably boy child. He was assigned male at birth, and chances are he's not going to be trans. And I'm so committed to like giving him so many options, especially at this young age. He's almost 3, and he loved wearing a new headband, and he loves sparkles, and he loves rainbows and unicorns. And like, when I drop him off at daycare and see all the other boy children, just like so narrow in their expression of like the animals they can like, the colors they can wear, the fit of the clothes, tight or loose, that they can wear, my heart breaks because it feels so limiting.
Yeah.
Like I know that my child can't fit just within those options. And I doubt many of the other kids can too. But they just have to, it's part of toxic masculinity. You just have to deny parts of yourself over and over again and repress it in order to fit in and not get harassed or attacked or stigmatized.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. My daughter's 4.5, and it's kind of my Brooklyn progressive dad, maybe disappointment, but she's super femme. That's just the stuff she likes. Like for Halloween, she's like, no, I want to be a unicorn ballerina fairy, and I'm like, are you sure you don't want to mix this? You can be anything you want, go any direction you want. Nope. She's just very, very classically gendered at this point, at the pre-K point. So yeah, maybe that could be our last conversation. How are your practices helping you with parenthood?
Wow. I think, so many teachers talk about going to their home of origin being like the trial for their teaching, like for their practice. If they're really, like if you think you're enlightened, go home to your parents, right? But I also think right now, if you think you're enlightened, hang out with a toddler for a couple of months. Patience and letting go, I think, are some of the biggest teachings he offers. I've learned that if I fight him, that he like wants to take off the shoes I already put him in and put on his galoshes before we go out the door when we're like already running late. If I'm like, no, you can't do that, then that's going to like make it even, we're going to be even further behind. So having patience when there's like room that I actually can give him, to allow him to do the thing that like he feels better wearing the galoshes today for whatever reason. I think another one of the teachings that he really embodies is letting go. That like something could be a really big deal for him and he's in tears and he's kicking and screaming, and then like a minute later it's gone. And I know that from neurobiology studies that emotions have a very short half-life, and I see it in the toddler, how quickly he can let something go that seems like a really big deal, like banging his head on something, is pretty incredible and encourages me in my own letting go.
Well, it's fascinating because, when you look at us as grownups, like what causes us to hold on to our emotions is usually the emotion has to join with a ingrained narrative, about who did what to who. And when you don't have that brain function yet, the emotion, it's really, mindfulness, that it just comes, it arises, dwells, and then ceases. And it's, it definitely makes the toddler look kind of bipolar or erratic in terms of their manifestation. But yeah, it's amazing to hold all that, isn't it? Yeah. Are you gonna? My daughter has gotten to the point where she'll come in and she'll want to blow out the candle, and she knows who the bodhisattvas are, like Tara and Manjushri. She also has an Aunt Tara, so she knows how to distinguish the Bodhisattva Tara from Aunt Tara, which is nice. But any work with mindfulness or downward dog or anything like that for yourself?
I mean, some of the postures he has a deck of yoga cards that he plays with and wants to play with sometimes. And sometimes I'll get him to like sit quietly for like a breath or two. Or also in the midst of something hard, we try to shift our own breaths as parents. And then sometimes he just does it automatically. It hasn't seemed very effective for us to be like, take a deep breath. Because then he's like, no, and gets mad at us for demanding that. But if we just model it, that seems useful. And then he totally, when he was 1 year old, he became very acquainted with the Buddha that Leslie has on her altar. And that was like, I think like the 7th word that he ever said was Buddha.
Wow, that's baller.
Yeah.
It's amazing. So good. Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question about like how much of this sort of building a new world really, because of neurobiology, is really going to rely on kind of helping people grow in the world in a different way with kind of not the same ingrained assumptions or cultural, or location assumptions. Yeah.
Different tools to rely on that. I mean, he can get them at age 3, whereas I got them pretty early at age 17, but that was many years. And
well, maybe he'll get really into basketball too. And then,
Totally. I can convince him to sit still and meditate.
It's been so great to talk to you, Jacoby Ballard, and I really want to encourage everybody to check out and pick up your book, which is A Queer Dharma, Yoga and Meditations for Liberation, which is out now. I hope you'll come back on the podcast, and it'd be great to talk again.
Totally. Thank you so much, Ethan.
All right. Well, for the Road Home podcast, this is Ethan Nichtern, and we'll see everyone next time.